It's a quiet start to our call today. Actually, a lot of people, I think, are still on vacation, but it's important on this call to just through a few details. What I'll do is I'll do the normal opening to the call and run through the project news and so on, and then we'll have a look at the spec, if that's okay with you, Chris.
Yeah, that'll be great.
All righty, let's hop right in. So this is the regular OpenChain monthly North America and Europe meeting. We took a break in August because people were on vacation. We're back here in September, though of course we do understand that many people are still on vacation too. We are recording this call and we expect most of our audience to be picking up the recording. As usual, we have a structured agenda. The way that these calls work is that we run through some of the project news. We have a look at what we're doing on the spec. We take a look at what the education work group is doing, and then we give people the opportunity to raise any other business. The first thing I'll do before we formally get started is just flag that we're operating this meeting as with all LF meetings under the antitrust policy. You can find the full policy on the LF website, and if you're from a member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. Now, jumping straight in, the news, and then we'll go to the spec stuff. So some recent news highlights. This is some stuff that's happened in the last month or two. The big context, of course, and the primary reason for this call is to work on our specs, which have been under a public comment period from June and will continue until December. So we've had a couple of months now when people have had the opportunity to look at our specs, and we've had a little bit of feedback, which we'll cover later in this meeting. In terms of general project news, we've had some interesting conformance announcements. For instance, IAV, a major automotive supplier in Germany, adopted ISO 5230 and released a case study. This was a third-party certification with an organization called Time to Act Group. And it's been very useful to bolster our portfolio of case studies. DSpace, another supply chain company, announced adoption of 5230, again in Germany, again in cooperation with a certifier. And they have not released a case study, but are, of course, announcing their conformance through our website, and hopefully we'll be hearing more from them about what they did over time. Samsung SDS just announced that they've adopted ISO 18974, our security standard. Samsung Group has been involved with our project for a long time, and it's great to see their adoption of our standards in different parts of the group proceeding nicely. We've switched up in China. We went from having periodic workshops and larger mini conferences into having a regular meeting schedule similar to what we do in Korea and Japan. ByteDance is currently chairing the China work group. We have one of the people brought in, a community advocate. So the head of the OSPO over at ByteDance is chairing the China work group until the end of the year when we'll enter our normal election cycle. And we've held meetings in Beijing and Shanghai over the last 2 months. The community meetings differ from larger workshops and conferences in that it's smaller groups really sitting down and digging into case studies and chatting away. The next meeting will probably happen in about 2 months, so we can expect that schedule. And that means we'll probably see that advertised given the last one was the end of August, we'll probably see it advertised for something like the end of October or similar. In July, and this is something that was briefly covered in our last meeting, but I wanted to flag again, we've released printable versions of our supplier education leaflet and the Telco SBOM guide. These printable versions build on earlier Markdown releases and are examples of the type of document we're trying to make available for easy printing and distribution. We've continued our webinar schedule. I particularly wanted to flag that we had a case study as well as webinar around a company called Engine, which adopted 5230, and that joined our IAV case study as one of two substantial documents showing how companies did stuff. We have things coming in September. The most important thing to flag is probably the automotive workshop scheduled for the 10th in Stuttgart, Germany. This will be a meeting of a lot of the German companies, automotive and other, at one of the Bosch buildings in Stuttgart. And of course, that means we're also in proximity to companies like Mercedes and so on. October is going to have something pretty important in that it's got the Open Compliance Summit. The Open Compliance Summit had its call for papers until early August, and now the schedule has been published in full. So I'm going to just drop a link to the schedule into our conference chat. It's looking pretty good. We have a lot of international speakers and so on and so forth. Educational work group flagged that their maturity modeling document should be available around that conference in a beta format. That maturity modeling references our ISO standards, but is more generally about open source maturity modeling. The AI study group was meeting until July. It took a break in August and decided to have a break in September as well because a lot of people are out. But we have seen a lot of progress with the AI study group. And this month, as announced recently, we'll also include an AI webinar on the 24th of September, more details on our calendar and so on. So all in all, we've had case studies, conformance announcements around both our standards. We have some interesting conferences and events taking off. We have continuity in terms of regular community meetings and transferring China over to that type of schedule. Things are looking pretty good, especially considering it's the holiday period. Just pause there before we dive into the work on standards and see if anyone has any questions at this time. All righty. We are moving into the standards thing. Chris Wood, our chair, is on the line. And Chris, I understand that basically our main business today is to look at the feedback that's come in as pull requests on the public comment period. And that's our focus today. Would that be correct in your view?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Chris, would you like me to share my screen and show the pull requests so we can dive through them?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All righty. So I'm just going to do that right now. I'm going to pull up the ISO 5230 pull requests. So this is feedback that has been received mostly at events, actually. And a couple, I see we had, I think Yari submit a couple directly as pull requests during the public comment period. For those of you who are new or would like a recap, the public comment period is not designed to re-edit proposed draft standards. It's where we look at proposed drafts that have been under an almost 2-year review process by the community, and we give people an opportunity to find typos or language that needs improving on clarity. Jeff, thank you for posting that link. Much appreciated. Starting at the bottom, let's have a look at the first item. This is a pure typo. So Yari found a typo on the document. Let's have a look at specifically what the typo was, and then we can confirm if we're going to accept it. Yeah, it's a very simple typo in the introduction area. So it should say iteration, and there was just a typo on the word iteration. Chris, I think this looks like a very simple one to just merge. What do you think?
I agree. I don't think there's much question about that one.
All right, now for form's sake, this is open to everyone on the call. If you have an objection to us merging this, now is the moment to do it. I see a thumbs up from Mary and a nope, no objection there. All righty. No one has raised any objection. Prasad has given a thumbs up. Mary Hardy has given a thumbs up, and basically then we merge that. This pull request will be closed. And when it comes to small pull requests like this, which are just tiny documentation things, we merge that directly. If someone found something much larger, we'd have a different process, because of course we don't want to split copyright on the document. Okay, second item, Yari again, and I'm working from date. I'm going the oldest to the newest. Yari just said in the markdown under terms and definitions, some subheadings had 2 and some had 3 hash marks. So just their formatting to be header level 2 or header level 3. So he changed them all from mixture to change them all to level 3. Let's have a look at what he did. Alrighty. Okay, so he flagged that some of these headings, so from 2.4 to 2.9, they had 2 hash marks as opposed to earlier ones that had 3. So he proposes changing them all to 3. Chris, I think that's also kind of a no-brainer. We just want to make sure the subheading levels are correct. What do you think?
I think that's reasonable.
Can we just double check the assumption that everything else has 3? Like if you scroll down, I'm sure that it's correct. I don't want to be remiss. So if you go like to the next row of code below the corrections.
I'm going to pull it up in that
Or
separate document, and I'll have that in just a second.
okay. I know it's probably fine, but I just thought maybe.
Yeah, because he said that some had 3 and some had 2, but
Yep.
I only see 2 in the ones that he marked up.
Yep.
I didn't see an example.
I'm just pulling this
Good
up.
question.
I just need a second to pull up the document. Yep. Okay. I'm sharing the document because I'm sharing the core document itself. All right. So here we go. This is from definitions. And we can see 2.1, 2.2, 2.3 are all subheading level 3. But then 2.4 goes to sub. Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it.
Confirmed.
Confirm.
Yep.
Good to dig in.
It is.
All about the process. All right, given that it appears to be correct, if anyone has an objection to merging, you can raise that now. If not, I'm going to merge it either by resolving the conflicts or manually fixing the document later. Are there any objections to that? All right, no objections. I'm just going to have a quick look and see what resolving the conflicts would involve. Okay, that's just a tiny patch issue. So I'm going to resolve that later. There's nothing there. Reviewed. I'm just going to put a note here of when we reviewed it. Resolve. Okay. So I've just added a comment there and I'll come back to it. So that was this pull request, and this leaves us with items I've had flagged to me during the last couple of months as we either look at the document or have it reviewed elsewhere. Okay, the DCO check failed because GitHub's thing automatically reformatted my sign off and they didn't like the DCO check on that. But anyway, ignore that. That's not important. The suggested change is from some text, and I'll pull up the section in a second. The text is to fix a typo. Is and may were contained at the end of the sentence when it should just say software may contain. So, and a suggestion of changing the word identifying to examine. So the original, a set of open source software licenses identified as a result of following an appropriate method of identifying open source components from which the supplied software is or may contain, to a set of open source software licenses identified as a result of following an appropriate method of examining open source components which the supplied software may contain. Let's take a look at where that comes from and why this matters. Okay, so this is from identified licenses. This is a definition as opposed to a requirement. And this definition is therefore designed to clarify something and explain what is an identified license. The original sentence is here in red. The proposed change is in green. Can people see the screen? Is it readable at this text size?
Yes.
All right. So the question then is, identified and identifying are used in the original sentence. And the suggestion changing identified and then instead of identified, examining is purely aesthetic to make it read better. And the question is that okay, or does it feel like a change? And then there's the typo where is and may were left in the document when it should just say may contain. And that's just a legacy typo, which came at the end of the editing process. Does anyone have any objections to the change? The typo is self-evident. The aesthetic, changing that to this, is perhaps more open to conversation.
So
Now,
Shane,
again, yeah, go ahead.
this is Jeff. I like the second examining. Whenever we have a definition where it's almost like a circular dependency, where defining identified by using the word identified.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that, I like the second change, identifying to examining. I wonder if we should change the first identified, maybe that's discovered. Maybe there's another word that we can use just so we don't have a circular reference or a, defining something using the same word, especially for, English as a second language or whatever. That would be my only comment on this, is if we could change the first one without being too weird or too overly wordy, that might be nice to have not a circular reference.
It's a really good point. And, Jeff, I think kind of nail on head there to make it easier for non-native speakers to read, identified licenses, identified, identify. It can be more complex.
But then maybe we're giving them 3 new words that they have to learn instead of just one. Not sure.
Also valid.
This is a very long sentence.
That's a good point.
I think it's good to use a comma or whatever. It's quite long from, if I use the grammar I learned from the school, it's difficult to break.
Right.
Especially the first part, like a set of open source licenses identified as a result of following approach of. It's long for me.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, it'd almost read better if it said discovered and then get rid of as a result of following and just say discovered in or using an appropriate method of examining open source components. Because there are an awful lot of words in that.
And
I
Chris, your
suppose,
method is a more direct way of saying it.
Pardon me.
I think your suggestion is a more direct way of saying it, which I always appreciate.
Hmm.
The result of following, you could just say, by using a
Yeah.
little bit.
that's a really good point. And Mary, what do you think about changing a set of open source into open source licenses? This is a question to
Yeah.
every minute.
I'm thinking, I think it's okay to remove because we have plural licenses.
Right.
Trying to think, maybe we should check where this phrase is used in the spec and make sure that the definition still makes sense with our proposal.
Alrighty, I'm just going to pull up the spec.
So I'll do a word search, a term search.
Yep.
I mean, it's not a significant change, but I want to make sure it's not a significant change.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to pull up the screen share. So we're going to do that run through of that now. All right. Identified licenses, where are they in the document? Bill of materials, a process shall exist for creating and managing a bill of materials that includes each open source component and its identified licenses. Next time, license obligations, a process shall exist for reviewing the identified licenses to determine obligations. Next one, verification material, a documented procedure that describes the process under which the compliance artifacts are prepared and distributed as required by the identified licenses. And another one, this is a very long section, documented procedure for archiving copies of the compliance artifacts of supplied software, where artifact is planned to blah, 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 reasonable period of time as required by the identified licenses. And then finally, rationale, reasonable efforts instituted in the preparation of compliance artifacts as required by identified licenses.
Okay, I don't see any conflict. Does anyone?
And the proposal here is open source software licenses identified by using an appropriate method of examining open source components which the supplied software may contain.
Instead of, I think 4 might work better in there. An appropriate method for examining, or
Oh, right.
I wonder if that's implied. Like, do we need that parenthetical or whatever we want to call that clause there?
yeah,
You know,
that's a good question.
It is judgy, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like your method wasn't appropriate.
like short and sweet. Like we say, like open source software licenses discovered by examining the open source components in the supplied software. So we, if we get rid of, like, our assumption is that anything you do is the appropriate method. We're an ISO spec.
That's a really
Yeah.
good point. And Mary, when you said judgy, it's both funny but super true. We definitely want to avoid the feeling that we're putting people onto a rail when we don't have to.
Yeah, or you have to use certain software tools and services, else it's not appropriate. Yeah, we're trying not to proscribe tools. So I like this better.
One question I have about identified licenses is there is two philosophies maybe on the identified licenses. One is it is the actual text or indicators text that's found. Is it the text of the MIT? Is it the SPDX license identifier for a license? There's also the inferred license. I see a hash and I know that it is Apache 2.0 because it's a certain jar. My assumption here is that it is, all the above. It is both discovered and inferred. But I just want to confirm with the crew here that we're not just saying actual licenses versus inferred licenses.
Well, the definition of discover, according to the Oxford Dictionary, says it can mean to find or become aware of. So I think that covers everything.
Yep.
It's just a question in specs of if something is not said, is it are we allowed, are we able to infer that, or do we have to be specific? And that's maybe a separate question from this current text, but that's when I read this, that was one of my questions.
I think that's a really, it's a really pertinent question. And the line we have to walk in this one is fascinating because we don't want to be unclear, but fundamentally, the person who decides what discovered, what that means or what the process should be, would probably be the customer-supplier relationship. So the customer in their contract would say, look, here's what we expect you to discover. Here's what we want you to cover this scope. And beyond this scope is not our issue, but inside the scope we demand, which may then differ with another, relationship in the supply chain. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are several really good ways of inferring software licensing within a package that they're not bulletproof, and there's probably a gradient that separates some of them, but things like naming conventions and things like the author's name and things like that. And if you can find the author's name elsewhere in that same package, then you just infer that he probably intended to use the same license, and that's why he didn't attach it to that file. There's a variety of inferences that you could make and then show them to your legal counsel and see if the legal counsel buys them. But I think inferring is a good, is a valid methodology. So yeah, I agree.
I just want to show something which is related to this topic. In the introduction, we talk about we focus on what, why, rather than how and when. And as we touched on the topic, and as Jeff pointed out, do we need to clarify things further? So looking at exactly the item we're discussing now, subtext as determined by the customer. Now, I'm not suggesting we put this in. Or Okay, so the inference here is that all of this stuff is determined by the customer-supplier relationship or agreement. And I guess the question is, do we need to add stuff like that in general to our standards, or does our introduction with this sentence already scope that? Does that make sense?
For me, this is kind of the licenses is kind of foundational to the whole spec. And when I've done this type of compliance before, one of the biggest sticking points is, I thought you meant this. No, I meant this. So the sell side always wants like maybe the least amount of compliance, in the sense of like, oh, I don't want to dig too much because I don't want to find stuff. The buy side wants to have a lot of compliance because they don't want to inherit something problematic.
Right.
And there's this tension between, whether you want to call it creation side and use side, or buy side, sell side. And by having some ambiguity in the spec, are we leaving dissatisfaction with the process by somebody? is it too strict on one side? Is it too lenient on the other? And I know the highlighted part that we have right there. I don't want to derail this one thing, but because it's so foundational, I think, to the whole process. What is a software license? How deep should we go? That's just why I wanted to bring that up.
And it's a very valid point. I mean, it's a tension we observe in our community where supplier side people want lower burden, and customer side some want to increase burden.
Mm-hmm.
Press ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. So I think there's great discussion going on. I kind of was listening to this and just wanted to reflect a couple of points. Yeah, I think definitely the aspect that I think Jeff was earlier pointing out of how restrictive or how lenient is definitely depends on which party that is referring to. So one aspect of like normalizing it, or I would say moderating it, is the specific organization's policies. So a given organization might have their OS open source legal policy, and that legal policy might dictate the level of scrutiny that one might be willing to take from an organization standpoint. The other aspect that I wanted to also bring up is some of these components are, the licensing wise, it's conjunctive, and in some cases it is disjunctive. And when it comes to the inference of licenses, whether your component is in conjunctive or disjunctive, and the how elaborate your source archive, the actual open source archive, is with regards to the associated dependencies and the dependencies, the licenses associated with those dependencies also play a crucial role in the inferred license. So it is possible that you may have a license.txt for a given open source component, which is Apache, but if it has, let's say, a dependency which is maybe one layer below inside the archive, which is more higher restrictive copyleft, then the policy for that organization might choose to go conservative and assign a more conservative license to that component, whereas another organization willing to take the risk might go with what is there designated in the license file. So it is a bit, I would say, gray area, but I think the organization's TPS, like the respective third-party open source policy, might come in, and obviously with the legal providing input to guide that.
And I suppose this takes us to an interesting tension. Yeah, Jeff is hitting on it as well. There's a few things that are almost certainly wrong. Like if someone says, let's just ignore the open source licenses. Let's forget about the terms, we don't care. And you think that's almost certainly wrong. But when it comes to the gray area of how much do we need to cover, what do we need to do? The biggest question is it our job to arbitrate that? And the biggest answer is not really. It's our job to let the supply chain fight it out and determine for this customer and supplier relationship, here's where they set the bounds. Then there's the question which Jeff just raised, if we want to increase trust, do we need to set lower bounds or expectations? And that seems to be where the tension is on this call. I don't mean negative tension, I mean talking through it tension. And honestly, I feel like the answer is probably we would have to avoid setting any determinate bounds, because the supply chain, the industries, all of that, apart from someone doing something like saying, let's ignore license terms, which we can say unambiguously, that's not a good idea. Everything else we've marked as, that's a how. That's not our problem. We let people solve that in their customer supplier relationship. So we say, use an appropriate method. And then we also say, have at it. You determine the appropriate method for your group. Which,
But
yeah,
I was just thinking, aren't we kind of dumbing down the supply chain by letting them do whatever they want as long as they determine that it's appropriate? Because if I've got some open source software that's out there in GitHub and it's got one or two authors or three authors or hasn't been maintained in 3 years, and you don't have any information about the dependencies, whether they're transitive dependencies or permanent dependencies by compiling the software, you really don't know what you've got. And so to me, if they don't provide that level of detail that to the best of our knowledge, we're delivering you software and here's all of the licensing that we could find, including that in the dependencies, then to me, I have to go back and redo that piece of software. So
I guess
there's another thought approach to, do we want to make the supply chain better, or do we just want to give them some guidelines to where they can halfway go toward making it better? Does that make sense?
it does. And I think it takes us back to the sort of the preachy section of the sentence, appropriate method, which is sort of designed to trigger a conversation of what's appropriate. And then the supplier and customer will say to each other, here's what I think is appropriate. And sort of to trigger the discussion so both parties would start to look at it. And that was the original purpose of using that terminology. And I suppose the question is, if we lost that terminology, are we moving the conversation too far in the direction of making things ambiguous? Is the slightly normative term appropriate, which provokes the discussion, what's appropriate for me, something that we might need to make sure we provoke that discussion with the supplier and customer?
My
I think
thought,
as Chris pointed out, I think, one thing might be very clear, Shane. I think just like as you earlier alluded to, that, not considering open source compliance is, at all, that is a no. Very similar. I'll probably put the use case that Chris brought out, where let's say you have one or more open source components for a given software, and let's say for some of those components we do not have actual information to infer licenses one way or other. That is also, in my opinion, it's no, because it is definitely adds risk to the overall supply chain. And no matter what the type of methods that one may try to, work out between the organization, in this case, the service provider and the customer, there is always going to be that, risk of unknown, especially if it is using open source components with no license references or no, from where that there is no license could be inferred, right? So there is possibility of that. I think we should completely avoid by having the right specification, enforcing that at least at the bare minimal, every open source that is being used for the software has some license association associated with it, without which they should not be using that open source at all. Is
And I
that
suppose this takes us into an area where we're going to have to talk more about this. And I'm just going to make a note here. Jeff said two things. I'm just making note of your things you said here, Jeff, but I'm actually going to say that we probably can't proceed to dig through this topic for this version of the spec. And I'll show you why. Because in the public comment period, this 6-month period, we only accept minor updates such as typos or grammar. And we do not accept material changes. And this conversation indicates a material change.
Mm-hmm.
So this conversation is valid. It's good the public comment period brought it up. But according to our spec development process, we have to stick a pin in this and put it on the next release cycle, if that makes sense.
I would agree with that.
Now,
Agree.
yeah, and this doesn't mean we're going to forget it. Opposite, this is the first major topic for the next release cycle. But it does mean that we probably need to rebase, and even the suggestion here of adjusting the sentence to this is probably moving beyond typo and grammar. It's beginning to change the meaning of the sentence slightly, clarifying it according to what we think, but that moves beyond the public comment period process itself. So we probably need to rebase with exactly the suggested change here for clarity, and either use the green or not, and then to take all the feedback that is difficult to read, that we might want to be more or less prescriptive, and to put that into the next cycle of editing. Unless people on this call feel that this suggestion or something near it is not a material change, and we could adjust the sentence to make it shorter, not material change. But the general bigger conversation we've touched on has to go into the next version. And I'm going to actually give us two suggestions for not material change to try and address the grammar question, which Mary Wang pointed out. This is the suggested change. Could we make it smaller by just removing a set of open source licenses and just say open source licenses identified? And that keeps in the appropriate method thing. And it just says we put the conversation later. Or can we change it further into this? Or is this more than typo and grammar? Is this now beginning to change materially what the sentence means? Because we can't do that in this edit cycle.
Well, since you identified a reason that the appropriate method language was included, that raises to the level of significant change, I think.
Okay.
Not just a typo. Yeah.
Yep. So we need to keep the current structure. Then the question would be, we keep the current structure, we're moving all the rest into a new issue I'll open. Is it okay to change a set of open source software licenses identified as a result of following an appropriate method of identifying open source components from which the supplied software is or may contain, to change that to a set of open source software licenses identified as a result of following an appropriate method of examining open source components which the supplied software may contain? Is the suggested change material, or is it just grammar and typo? The typo is here is May to May, and identifying and examining would be clarifying grammar. Do you agree or disagree that that is an acceptable baby step for now and move the rest to the next? Or is that an unacceptable baby step that somehow is perceived as changing the meaning?
I agree with Jeff that it's better, but it is a different verb.
Okay.
right?
So in-
Identifying open source components is different from examining open source components, I think.
So in that case, perhaps we just fix the typo only and move all the rest to the next conversation.
I would, this is Jeff, I would agree with that.
Okay,
I think if we're changing verbs, we're going perhaps beyond the intent of this phase.
Yep.
Mhm.
okay. I'm moving all the rest. I'm gonna just take this text, I'm putting it into a document for myself. And I'll open an issue and send it to the list.
Yeah, I'm almost thinking that if we're going to have that deeper conversation, that we probably need to really talk about whether or not we need to define what is appropriate somewhere, so that that's no longer a vague suggestion. Because to me, appropriate is, unless you've defined what appropriate is, it's very vague. I mean, it's whatever you want to do. And if it's whatever you want to do, even if it's between the supplier and the buyer, it still doesn't suit the rest of the supply chain necessarily.
Right.
So we may want to talk about that more in depth if we're going to discuss the rest of it.
Now that makes sense. Okay. So this would mean that for this call, for this thing, we correct the typo and we only accept that typo. Everything else moves to an issue for future. And as Chris said, that's a bigger topic. So that issue I'll open on it, we'll start with minimal and we can build it out. And we'll do it on these calls. We'll even be able to do it adjacent to the public comment period, which is frozen on this version of the spec, draft 3.0. We can begin working on draft 4.0 simultaneously. It's just not in the public comment period for this. Okay, I made the comment. I will merge the accepted change unless there's any objection, and I'll move the rest into a new issue, which will be open for a future draft version of the spec. Is there any objection to that? All right. Great. I'm just pulling us back. This is point 2. I'm sure some of our listeners will be like, they're being really pedantic. Yes, we are.
Sorry.
That's
I'll
what
be quiet.
No. This is exactly what we need to do. The whole process is about digging in and deciding if there's something to talk about and if we can talk about it now or later and why. So I just want to clarify, this and this are both closed with minor changes as put into the comments. I will merge them later because there's conflicts I need to deal with on GitHub. Next item, 2.7. Right. This came in as a suggestion for improving the software bill of materials description. And let me check what the change is. I just need one moment. Oh, okay. Yeah, the change is basically a typo. SPDX, for some reason, had software package data exchange in parentheses, and then SPDX not, where technically speaking, software package data exchange is the full term and SPDX is the contraction, so that should be in parentheses. That's the suggested change, saying that we had parentheses around the full term and not the contraction. We should have parentheses around the contraction, not the full term. That's that seems reasonable to me. What do you think? Because
Shane, just one comment here. I think that makes sense to me. The only thing that I just wanted to point out is the SPDX have, I believe it recently got rechristened. It is supposed to be the system package data exchange, but again, that started only with the recent rollout of the 3.0.
Yep.
Is what I
Oh, they've
so that's
actually
something that,
changed it.
yeah. So
Oh, good catch.
that's been part of that forum, so you may want to maybe think about updating that as well.
Gosh, sorry, Mary, you said something as well. I missed
Oh,
it.
I was like, hey, good catch. I didn't think
Yeah,
of
that's
wonder,
new.
I
Yeah.
wonder if, yeah, it is new. And I'm wondering if they did it because they're including AI data and security references in there as well. And those, well,
Yeah, no,
yeah,
I think the greater plan is they are, I mean, at least I know because I'm part of one of the profiles, but there is a plan to include hardware profiles, probably 3.1, not 3. Yeah, I think 3.1 probably, not a 3.0 that just went out in April. So this is just more of a prior step to that. They, instead of converting, I mean, saying specifying software, they want to change that to a system. So this is something that just a recent nomenclature update that just came with the 3.0. And you are right. I think 3.0, we do have new profiles for AI and data, and not just even AI data. I think there's also build profile and a few other profiles being added to that spec.
Okay, but the ISO standard does say software package data exchange.
Right. So it's 2.2, right? So anything at 3.0 and beyond is what will have that system. It'll be called system package. Yeah. So the anything below 3, it's still software.
And Jeff suggested system or software, depending on which version of the spec you're using. That's a real question. What do we do now that the term has changed? Are we able to reference it in the same way?
probably not in what we're doing today. That's
Right.
going to have to be in the next version.
Right.
Yeah.
So right now we're suggesting that our ISO standard referencing the ISO standard is still using the term in their ISO standard. But we know they've changed the term on their de facto future version, which will also become a future ISO standard.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, 3.0 is already out. I mean, 3.0 just officially launched. So yeah, it's just a matter of time. 3.0 might get ISO certification.
Right.
Well, I can see where that's going to mess up all of the data scanners that are out there looking for licenses.
Yep.
Holy moly.
Okay. It seems right now the question of where the parentheses should exist is probably simple enough. The parentheses should be on the contraction. The issue of renaming is probably an issue for another day.
Right.
I think.
Yep.
My read of it is that it's not exactly correct English. Software bill of materials SBOM is a inventory for software.
Is an inventory, yeah. All right.
And then that definition is going to have to be changed when you change it to system.
Right. Okay. So we have a naming problem that we need to deal with, but that's an issue for another day to open. And I'm just going to make a note here for me to open that. So then the short version is, do we move the parentheses onto the contraction? Plus, do we fix the grammar here from a inventory, which is wrong, to an inventory for software? So 2 questions: fix the grammar, which seems like a yes, and move the parentheses onto the contraction, which is normal grammatical practice. Does anyone have objection to those two measures? Okay, no objections. Okay, I'm just going to make a note here. Flagged by. All right, so we're going to make that change, but there's going to be an issue opened about the fact that SPDX itself has changed its name. We're going to have to consider how to deal with that.
Well, if we're referencing the ISO spec, then technically
We're
they can
correct.
change the name all they want to. We're still referencing that version of the ISO spec, and it is still Software Package Data Exchange.
So one solution might be to change our reference to just make sure we reference the exact version.
Yeah, version 2.2.0, wasn't it?
Yeah, 2.2.1, I think. Yeah. Yep, 2.2.1. Okay, I'll make a memo. Yeah. Oh gosh. We are out of time, ladies and gentlemen. We've solved everything apart from one issue, but we're at the hour. So I think that the remaining issue has to be pushed to the next call. And we have one issue open on security, but again, that's got to be on the next call. I realize that's imperfect in that we hope to close everything, but these were wide discussions and also created two issues to open on the future drafts of the spec. Does anyone have any objections to calling it a day here and taking what we've done as the work completed for today?
No, I think that was a good meeting.
All righty. Thank you very much, everyone. And just so you know, the reference material thing, rather than work on reference material, just wanted to flag that we do have an education work group meeting tomorrow, and that's on our global calendar. So Andrew just wanted to say that there are two things going to be covered, the maturity model reference material, plus the explainers explaining OpenChain to different types of managers. More about that on the call. Any other business today? You've got at least 30 seconds. All right. If there's no other business, we close the meeting here with great thanks. We dug into a lot of stuff, and I think we had some key issues for future drafts of the spec, but also we did some really useful things closing public comments. And I appreciate you. All of you contributed so much. Thank you very much.